All right, so I guess I can begin. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this lunchtime. I'm Destiny Williams-Dobosz. I am a postdoctoral researcher at Boston College, and I am a part of the Division 15 Committee on the Development of Early Career Educational Psychologists. We are so excited to have our first webinar in our series, Advancing Tools for Early Career Scholars to Share Their Work. And we're excited to have opportunities like this one today, where we think about where we partner with the Division 15 Practice Committee to highlight the importance of translational research and translating research into practice. And so our panelists today include Dr. Margaret Powers, who is a third-year postdoctoral research associate at Washington University in St. Louis. As part of the Translational Fellows in Education program, she conducts applied research through research practice partnership approaches on topics such as chronic absenteeism, student mobility, and implementing trauma-informed education practices. She will share her expertise thinking about translating research to practice. And from the practice committee, we are joined by Dr. Alysia Roehrig, professor of educational psychology, who serves as the department chair of educational psychology and learning systems at Florida State, Dr. Elizabeth Kraatz, an assistant professor of educational psychology and research methodology and educational studies at Purdue University, and Dr. Michael Nussbaum, a professor of educational psychology and learning sciences at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. He is a former president of Division 15 and was instrumental in forming the practice committee. He's also currently the co-chair of the APA Policy Committee. Dr. Nussbaum studies argumentation in various environments and is the author of the forthcoming book in Cambridge University Press, The Waning of Wisdom, Psychology of Reasoning in the Post-Truth Era. And so with that, I'm thankful for all of you for joining us today and for our panelists. And so we will jump right in. And so our first question is, if you could, and I'll start with Dr. Powers, could you briefly describe translational research and explain what you believe is the overall value of translating research into practice?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question, and thank you all for having me here today. I'm really excited to share what I've learned, but then also just to hear from others. Um, I think I see translational research and education broadly as applying theory and evidence-based practices to practice and policy. So I think that can happen through at the school or building level or classroom level, working with teachers to implement evidence-based practices and strategies or to share findings for that. And then I also think, again, it can happen in the policy space, working with district leaders, school board members, state and federal education agencies to help advocate for policy based on what we know in the research. And so I think there's a wide spectrum of how folks can go about translating research to practice, from your implication sections at the end of your journal article to a practice brief, to partnering with educators and stakeholders to implement different practices and policies. And in my mind, in terms of value, I think translating research to practice is the whole point. I feel like there's a lot of, I think for a lot of us as education researchers, the ultimate goal of our work is to improve educational experiences for youth. And I feel like that doesn't happen without translating our research to practice and policy. So to me, that's, I think it's invaluable, and excited to talk about it. Thank you.
Any of our other panelists have thought, and I'll restate the question. So, what does translational research mean to you, and what is the value of translating research to practice?
Well, I'll just say it's all meant to make education better. So as long as the implementation is done effectively, so that's of course an important prerequisite.
No, I just want to, hi everybody. I just want to reiterate that it's th this is the point, right? I mean, I know that was already said, but that is why we do research, is so that we can help people to figure out what practices to use to improve things. And so this is an important step that I think that we don't do enough training on when we're in school, right? And so we're all here trying to figure it out.
Thank you. So I'll move to the next question. And so, especially for our early career folks and emerging scholars, I think this question will be really relevant. But what stage in the research process is a practice brief a suitable option? So, for example, in progress work, dissertation research, or after publication, what are your thoughts about like at what stage in our research we should be thinking about a practice brief and when is it best suited to?
Yeah, to me, I think there are ways in which a practice brief can be useful at all of those stages that you mentioned. I think if you think about it, the first step for most of those activities are a literature review. And I think summarizing the research that already exists in a digestible format to practitioners and to school leaders can be really helpful to continue to translate research to practice. And again, I think to your dissertation research and things like after publication have great value, and to put it in a digestible format that practitioners can pick up and read quickly, I think can be really powerful. I also think when I'm thinking about partnership in my work, when I'm working with a school partner, we know research can take a long time. So I try to also prioritize providing products early on while simultaneously conducting that part of the research that takes more time. So for example, again, I'll share a summary of the research we're looking into as we're working on a bigger project, or I'll provide the descriptive statistics that we're doing early on to help get an overview of what's going on. And again, sharing like preliminary findings of what we're seeing in the data, and of course, with clarity of how that data should be interpreted and things like that. But I think when working in partnership work, that can be helpful too, to continue to ensure like having that conversation.
Yeah, let me add, I think a great way to start is taking your research study results and submitting them to our new journal, which is called Educational Practice and Policy, or something like that. It's E3P. Then you'll get good reviews, hopefully, and if it's published, that would be a good time then to start also turning it into a brief. You're more likely to get it because the practice committee, we can only develop, so many briefs. But that's a good way to get it in the door. If you're thinking about developing briefs outside that process, I think generally it's a good idea to have a whole body of research supporting what you're saying, and not just, one dissertation study. But as Margaret said, if you did a really good literature review for your dissertation or for another study, then that would be appropriate. But generally, I think later in the research process, unless you're, of course, working with a specific school board, for example, then you could have, preliminary findings, but just for that audience.
Yeah, to build on that a little bit, I think with the published practice briefs that the committee puts out, I think there is an expectation that those are based in a body of literature, and that they're not, sort of, we have some indications that maybe this thing would be beneficial, right? It's more like this has been established through multiple research studies. Whereas, like Michael said, if you're working with a specific school district or something, that might be a time to provide that preliminary analysis. But the research briefs themselves that are published are not so much for things like preliminary analysis or initial findings.
Thank you for that. So I'll just bring your attention to some resources dropped in the chat. So first is the link to the Educational Psychology Journal for Policy and Practice, E3P. And then I also see another resource in the chat dropped by Dr. Powers about training from the Spencer Foundation. So feel free to click those links, check those out. I also just wanted to ask, because I'm hearing, for certain studies or like depending on your goals, the research brief, the published research brief, it may be better to go that option if you have preliminary work, but thinking more like research that you've done multiple studies. So I guess to ask a follow-up question, say someone who just completed their dissertation a year ago, is that a good point to be thinking about a research brief, or is that still too early? If you could just give more insights into that.
To me, I would think there's a couple ways that could be an appropriate time. I think the point that it should be kind of established in the literature, I think, is a good one. And I wonder if maybe your dissertation, you could kind of present it in a brief in conjunction with other related literature might be a good option. And then again, like if you worked with a school to conduct your dissertation, I would think giving a practice brief back to them would be really useful to provide this like contextually relevant insight to their school.
I second that. That's exactly what I would say. I mean, because you had to do a lit review, right? And so you can situate what you did in your dissertation in the literature to do a brief, right? That's grounded in can we say from the literature? But I always love giving back to those partners. So I think you can't say that too much. I think that's a great thing to do.
Because it is very helpful. So thank you for that. So I guess, how do you utilize practice briefs in your applied work, and what were some challenges that you have faced?
Yeah, again, I think we've been talking about this. I use them often in my in partnership with schools. Again, because I think you can provide these really contextually relevant and action-oriented implications from the work or actionable findings from the work. And so I'll just share one example from my postdoc. In my first year, I had a placement with a pre-K second grade charter school, and I was working closely with the principal to identify a project for us to work on, and was going to the school weekly, doing, joining classrooms, lunchtime, things like that, to kind of get a better understanding for the context. And I eventually came to realized that behavior was a top priority for the principal. Teachers and the principal mentioned challenges with classroom management, and they had applied a lot of like incentive structures or point systems or PBIS. And so I was like, this could be really great because motivation research has a lot to say about these things. So I was doing focus groups with teachers, and it wasn't necessarily like I'm collecting data, and I think that helped too for other reasons. But so we sort of just had a focus group to talk about the strategies they're using, when they're facing challenges, when they're seeing that it's working. And then I was able to kind of develop a brief from that to say, this is what your peers in your school are finding as really helpful. These are the strategies that are working. And this is what motivation research says on like why these extrinsic rewards, work in these instances and not these. And so I think that was really helpful, especially since it was, they're all working with a similar population. I think the approach resonated. And I've used briefs in other areas too, like we've already mentioned, like summarizing preliminary findings of studies, but with school partners, but also summarizing preliminary findings of a systematic literature review. I think that process takes a really long time to do a systematic literature review, but you're starting to get an idea of this literature as you're reading very often the work in that field. And so I think a preliminary brief in that case can be helpful. In terms of challenges, I think in general, it's difficult to tell if strategies like briefs have a significant impact. I think they need to be prepared with much more radical work, co-developing, curriculum or practices or coaching models or policy changes and things like that. And I think another challenge I faced is I have worked with some folks having sort of a deficit-based perspective or maybe a fixed mindset with some of the students that we're working with. And it is, I would say, nearly impossible to change someone's mindset. Mindsets and beliefs are really difficult to change with one brief or one conversation. And so again, I think it just needs to be paired with like deeper involvement. But I'm really interested to hear others' experiences too.
Yeah, I agree. These briefs are great to use like in a professional development or school partnership context. That also has a benefit that, there's local dissemination, whereas the ones that, are put out by the practice committee, it's not always clear how we're going to get them disseminated. So, to speak to your question, I also use at least one of the briefs as a course reading for my pre-service ed psych students, and that has worked out really well. So that's another context you can use briefs in.
Thank you for that. You guys are giving me like new ideas. I guess going back to this question, how do you utilize briefs? Are there challenges that you have faced? And I'll add on, since we're kind of shifting this way, how do you ensure that others apply your research appropriately and effectively?
I think that's a really big question. And, I, to kind of speak to both questions at once, I also use practice briefs as course readings for my undergraduate pre-service teachers. And I use them in conjunction with other readings and coursework, right? Because by the nature of being a practice brief, they are brief. And so they're not going to provide all of the background knowledge and context that may be needed to really apply research effectively. And so, if you've got a teacher or a principal or other administrator who is trying to change school policy or practice based purely on a 2-page research brief, then it's going to be limited how effective that implementation is going to be. And so in my mind, the practice briefs are really, really useful for giving people kind of directional ideas, saying, oh, hey, there's this topic that I should be thinking about, and then provide additional resources for more reading, maybe even some contacts for finding out more. So that way you can kind of have an idea, oh, this might be a good idea in my school or my classroom, but it's not going to provide you the whole picture, right? And I think that we probably need to make that clear when we're working with practitioners, that like, this is not everything you need to know. This is to get you started exploring this topic. But I mean, we're never going to be able to 100% ensure that they're taking our research and using it effectively in schools, right?
Yeah, I love this. They're basically like an entrance, right? And one thing that we're thinking about on the practice committee, as we try to provide feedback for people, is how do you use language and provide examples and talk about the the problem or frame the problem or maybe avoid the deficit perspective in ways that will invite people into thinking about something that they might not have thought about before. So there's a lot of like we're trying to, motivate people to think about these things, and it is just an entrance so that it isn't meant to provide the end all be all of like what you should do, but get them excited about it, hopefully.
And I'm thinking maybe that would be a great practice brief on the deficit perspective and if we can even change it. I mean, there has been some research, but including Carol Dweck's research, but yeah, I'd like to have that practice brief right now. One thing that we need to avoid is getting away from the what works mentality, because things have to be adapted to local conditions and context. But again, if you're working with school partners, help them with formative assessment to see if the implementation and the adaptations that they make are healthy rather than detrimental. But that can be worked into your research program.
Yeah, I think just building off of that, I think doing this work in partnership is a way to support this. I think as researchers, there's going to be a lot that's out of our control in terms of how our research is interpreted or implemented into practice. But I think, having these long-term partnerships with districts or state agencies, I think can help ensure that follow through. And I think also, again, building on Dr. Nussbaum's point of like working directly with a school or school district, I think you can see where a theory might have gaps or may not apply for this specific context or this specific population. And so I think that work can be really important for not only informing practice, but having that practice go back and inform theory, I think is really important as well. And I think too, this is an area where looking into implementation science is useful to identify, different strategies for fidelity and scaling interventions. It's a world I'm not super familiar with, but the more I'm, doing this partnership, the more I'm partnership work, the more I'm realizing that's something really important to lean into.
Thank you. So next we're going to shift we talked around practice briefs, but the practice committee, they're going to give us some more insights into what that process actually looks like. So first, what are some misconceptions about practice briefs, or what are things you think others should know about practice briefs?
I guess to start off, to reiterate or summarize maybe some points that have already been made. One, that they should be based mostly on a body of work, not a single study, right? So we're not looking at taking one single study and turning it into a practice brief so much as we are looking at a broader, perspective on a topic. And then I think there might also be a perspective, and I don't know this for sure, but that maybe because they're short, that they're really easy and quick. And I think, yes, they're short, but it really takes a lot of intentionality and focus and a different style of writing than we as academics tend to be used to translate research effectively and summarize it in ways that are going to be palatable and useful for practitioners. And then there's a lot of revision and back and forth and effort that goes into it from multiple parties to make sure that it kind of is the best that it can be, and the most effective that it can be. So it's not a matter of just, writing up 2 pages and then being done with it. It really is a very intentional and effortful process.
I feel like you really hit all the main points. I don't know if Michael has anything to add. I think one thing that he may want to speak to is how we treat policy briefs and practice briefs differently. And just sort of making sure people are aware of the differences there. At one point, we were the policy and practice committee, and then it was split up because we were trying to do, two related things, but they were still very different, and it was a lot. And so then we became two separate committees, but we're still doing different kinds of briefs.
Yeah, to speak to the policy briefs, the they're evolving. We haven't done as many as the practice committee. And part of that is that I was just appointed as a co-chair last year. So we're still trying to figure out the process. But in thinking it through, policy briefs could be a lot longer and should be a lot longer. It depends on who your audience is. If it's written for school boards, I think using the same format as a practice brief might be appropriate. But if you're looking for state legislators, usually they're looking for bills to sponsor. And so you should have more detail so they can design the legislation, at least get started on it. And two, there needs to be good evidence about how the benefits outweigh the costs, and all that is going to require a longer analysis. But they have staff that have more time to read the briefs. But saying that, then there should be an executive summary that which could also function as a short brief for those who just want to look at things quickly. So, and policy briefs could also explore different alternatives. I don't know. We're still trying to figure that part out. But they have to be also persuasive to the governor and the Department of Finance, which also requires a more solid analysis. Governor is the one that really holds a lot of the power. And then I don't really know much about doing briefs for the federal government. My experience has been mostly with state legislators.
And I believe we have one example. Can you pop the link in there, Joey? If you go to our practice brief site and you go all the way down towards the bottom, one of our earliest briefs was actually part of a pair, and it's linked in to the policy brief that goes with it. I think it's the one about teacher evaluation. Do you recall that, Michael? But y'all might go check that out. So that is also one way that we try to connect more information for folks. Is like sometimes there's also a podcast that's been done related to the brief, which goes into more detail, and that'll be linked in on the brief page as well. But I believe it was the teacher evaluation one that had a policy brief and a practice brief. And you can see the difference.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Thank you for that. Very insightful thinking about the difference between policy versus practice briefs. And there is a link to the chat. So thank you, Joey, for sharing that. Please check that out. But next, thinking about Dr. Roehrig, can you share your model for creating practice briefs and what your process looks like of submitting to the committee? Perfect.
I sure can. Okay, hopefully you can see here, I've got some slides. I gotta get us to the next one here. So we're gonna drop a link in the chat to a template that we use for the briefs. So this kind of goes to the idea of how do we go from these long papers that we're used to and trained to write, as Elizabeth said, right? Like how do we get from from there to these 2-page briefs, it is not easy. It takes many, many back and forths. And I know we've got, I saw at least several of our folks who've worked on briefs in the audience today. So feel free to speak up and share what that process was like. I'm sure you've got some great insights. So you can see here is just sort of a screenshot of how we try to help the new author of a brief think about what they want to include in it. And it really forces people to pare down and get at the essentials. I always try to say like bullet points. Nope, you don't need a lot of complete sentences. You want to make sure that you're really like hitting them over the head with like, why this thing, right? Sometimes it's focused on like, what is the problem? Um, and then, but you got to quickly tie that into like, well, okay, so what is this solution and why this solution, right? And then really, really making sure that you are careful about the jargon, right? Because we sort of get used to the jargon, but what do we mean when we say different terms, right? So making sure you have really clear definitions that people can understand regardless of, what background they have, and reading about different theories and whatnot is really helpful. We really like to have some visuals on our briefs to draw people in, but also to sort of illustrate key points. I know we had a brief that we were working on that they had like a graph in there that was more like a graph you would see in a paper, in a research paper, and it was like it was like mind bending to try to understand what it meant. And it was like, is there some other way, right? The way you've described what's in the table in your words actually is really helpful. Maybe we just need that. We don't need that graph, right? Whereas in a research paper, you need that graph. So that the image types are different than what you'd have in a research paper as well. And then we'll speak to this, and I've got some more slides on it, but like really making sure that you have concrete, actionable suggestions for practice, as well as resources people can go to if they want to learn more information. So we always have people we've been doing QR codes where people can go to see the references, so they can go back and look at the research if they want to do more, to understand more, but also where there's like an archive of links to web resources, whether that's curriculum materials or other kinds of materials that would help support their practice. And then you do see here, we try to encourage folks to have like a gaps and limitations kind of thing, like things for people to think about, right? Because we don't want people to sort of just take this and just plain old apply it, right? We want them to think through, okay, what are some of the potential roadblocks or places where this may or may not work as we might think it should because of the limitations in the research. Here's sort of a typed up summary of that.
Thank you. And I'm
Anybody
also,
else?
go ahead.
I would just say, anybody else want to jump in on that?
I think two things that I've noticed that I think we as researchers have a tendency to do is one, we want to maybe over convince people by providing lots of statistics and numbers. And that is often not an effective way to provide that information to practitioners who may not have the same background in data that researchers do. And so thinking through, if you're going to provide numbers, are they really necessary? Do they tell your story effectively? Right? All of those things. And then also, I think we tend to have an inclination to say things like, autonomy support is really important. So we need to make sure that we are providing autonomy to our students. And it's like, well, that's fantastic. But what does that mean to a teacher, right? How do I do that? And so when we're talking about things like actionable and efficient, right, that it needs to be really concrete. Go into your classroom and do this thing, not sort of like a broad umbrella of strategies. We need to be more specific than that, I guess.
what I'm hearing is moving beyond just like the theoretical, but getting very practical, actionable, and efficient. So thank you. So next I want to ask, I guess, how do you ensure that people read our practice briefs or use them? Or you've talked a little bit about making them actionable. Do you have any more insights for just dissemination, and how do we ensure that folks see this work out there?
I think that's the part I think Michael sort of alluded to that we struggle with a bit, right? Is how do we encourage folks to get these out there? So we tried to connect with the greater APA organization, and they did highlight some of our work to connect it to psychology educators. We had some relationship with the NEA, and we haven't so much lately. We try to in our own local spaces, right, connect the people that we work with in our own local schools and states and projects with these resources. But I think we need to do more work with getting these out there so that people know they're there and are sharing them. And we have ideas we haven't implemented, like would we be able to set it up? We need Wade's help to be able to set it up, right, for like a subscription or something like that. So it's really kind of low tech at this point, right? The way that we have been doing it.
One thing the policy committee has are state policy liaisons for, I wouldn't say every state, but with several of the states. Some of the liaisons have also been sending out practice briefs to stakeholders, so we could rely on that a little more too. But I would, be happy to hear ideas from the audience too on this problem.
Yeah, so thank you. I'll just turn to the audience attention. There's been a lot of resources dropped in the chat, so please check those out. Thank you, Joey, for submitting the template for practice briefs. And also thank you, Martinique, for dropping a link to Dr. Nussbaum's book. And I also see there's a 20% discount. So please check those out. So I'll end with one last question before we turn to Q&A. I guess, do you have any words of encouragement for someone who's thinking about submitting a practice brief, but maybe they're a little like shy or hesitant, or any words of encouragement?
I'd say reach out. People email me all the time and say, "Hey, I've got this idea," and I say, "Well, if you've got an idea, write up a little something about it and send it to us, and we'll talk about it at our next meeting." I think going back to what Michael said, that we do have sort of a limited sort of ability to do this because it takes so much time back and forth, that we usually only get a handful of them out a year. But that's why I love the suggestion of, submit to the E3P journal, right? And that is the goal there, right? To have those things turn into briefs eventually, to create your own and share them in social media. And one other thing that we're hoping to do is some of the folks on the committee were doing an edited handbook about applied ed psych, and we're going to be having the authors do basically they're doing a lit review, right, for their chapters, focused on how do we apply different aspects of ed psych, a brief. They're going to have to do a 2-page brief. And we're going to be working with the publisher to get them free and up there as well. So there's, I think there's just ways for us in our, and that was something I negotiated with the publisher, right? Like, we want to do this. If we're going to do this, we want to make sure people can access these things for free and use them. Not just write about chapters in a handbook that somebody has to buy. So I think that we can push these things ourselves in our agendas.
To add on to that, I'm probably the newest member of the practice committee. I've been on the committee for about a year. And they are an incredibly supportive helpful group of people. And so, if you're feeling a little iffy, like I'm not sure how to word this thing, I'm not sure how to go about writing it, like you will get help. You are not like left out on your own, right? You will get multiple iterations of feedback. I think probably just about anybody on the practice committee would be happy to provide support to you if you need it. And so, it's not something that I think is as intimidating as it might seem at first, because you will absolutely get support throughout the process.
Any words of encouragement or supportive words of advice, Dr. Nussbaum?
Yeah, just if you think you're ready to do a practice brief, just reach out to us and give us your ideas, and we can give you some feedback.
Dr. Powers, any last words to share?
Nothing major. I'm very excited about these ideas and conversations, and excited to submit to the APA Division 15 practice briefs. Yeah, I think this is wonderful. I think this has been said, but I'll just reiterate from what I've heard from practitioners that I think researchers can sometimes get lost in the background. This is been said, but of justifying the significance and things like that. And so just as quickly as you can, getting to those actionable findings from your work and from the literature more broadly, I think is where things can be most impactful.
Thank you. I've personally learned a lot, so I'll open it up for Q&A.
I would love to ask a question. First of all, thank you all very much for this great conversation, and I really learned a lot. It seems like there are potentially two different briefs that have been discussed. You have one outside the policy and practice. Amongst the practice, there are those that you might, to Dr. Power's point, create for your partners. And then there's the ones that maybe are being launched to be seen nationally, like with NEA or through Division 15. Can any of you speak to the qualitative difference between one that may be presented back to a partner or agency organization, and then one that maybe is submitted to be disseminated nationally?
My first thinking on this is like the versions that we've talked about, where it's like a summary of the big things that we're seeing in the broader literature, I think would be something, that's really evidence-based. There's been, randomized control trials or quasi-experiments and meta-analyses that you could really provide some summaries that are really well rooted in the research, I think would be really well suited for a more national audience. Where I think the advantage of at a practitioner level is, one, maybe providing in general a topic that's especially important to your school partner. Like, for example, I'm in St. Louis, and student mobility, students transferring from different schools, is a really prominent issue there. And so that's something we've done, different types of, white papers and practice briefs and things like that for that. Where I feel like you can provide, you can use, state data to show what this looks like in your district, in your school, and also, couch it within the literature, broader literature. And so I think that can be really powerful. And I think this doesn't necessarily answer your question, but I think another kind of use of these published APA Division 15 briefs is this can be a way to start building a relationship with your school partners if they're mentioning wanting more resources on a topic that there's an existing brief out there that saves you some time. You don't necessarily have to write it, and you can show them this resource. And I think when you can create a dialogue around it with your partner rather than just sending it in an email, I think that's how you can better ensure that people are reading it and digesting the information too.
Any other questions from us? Feel free to just unmute or drop your questions in the chat.
Hi, hi Alysia. That's saying hi to Alysia. It was my major professor when I was at FSU. So one of the things I've been thinking about is when you talk about the gap between research and practice, and sometimes you might have evidence of something, and you put a brief together, and then you're hoping, right, that people will find it and use it, but you don't really know. It's a hope. One of the things I think of, my work. I'm an applied researcher, right? I work with the regional laboratory, occasional laboratories, and the comprehensive centers, and our clients are all state education agencies and regional educational agencies and district leaders and things like that. So one thing I would suggest is like you can leverage people like me to try to bridge that gap. I see those people. I talk to those people that you're trying to reach all the time. Like those, I have constant meetings with them, and I can tell just by looking at some of the briefs you have come out that I can definitely point them to that direction. I could be someone who can bridge that gap and be like, hey, you guys are wondering about violence in your schools. Here's what research I put together that you can read. I give you the link, things of that sort. And also it could be a way for you to come up with the topics that they are interested, that you might be able to, put together something for them. So it could be a two-way street, not just what your topic that you are interested in, but also what they are interested as practitioners that you might be able to connect back to, and that way building those bridges. So I would just suggest, you can reach out, you can reach out to me or other people I know that have that connection that can help you translate the research, or research slang that we use into something that is more digestible to a practitioner. I would definitely say yes. There, as a researcher, we tend to over explain things for practitioners, and it's easier to like using a more like actionable language. And it's a skill, right? That you have to learn how to translate. It's not as simple as here is with all the jargon, and it just kind of goes over their head. So anyway, so I'm just putting that out there. If you guys just consider sort of people like me to try to bridge that gap.
If I could build on that just a little bit, I think teacher educators are also people who can really help bridge the gap, because they're assigning readings and working with the pre-service teachers while they're in college. And hopefully if we can help teachers realize that these resources exist, then when they start having questions or issues, they'll know where to look to get an idea of more resources and that kind of stuff. And additionally, as far as knowing what issues are important in schools, right? If you're working with pre-service teachers, they're in classrooms, right? They're seeing the issues that are happening in the school. A lot of mine sit in on faculty meetings. And so by having conversations with them, I also get an idea of what needs are present in the schools that we might be able to address to help build those bridges and make sure that we're providing the support that our school partners really need.
Two things I would add on top of that. I think those are great ideas. And I think another way to kind of get a pulse on what local districts in your area are interested in is looking at like strategic plans, which is usually publicly available. You can also often look at board minutes, or board meetings are often published on YouTube and things like that. You can see what they're talking about and what their needs are. And then the other thing, going back to your point as well of pre-service teachers, I think another way of translating research into practice too is better equipping pre-service teachers to go into the field with data literacy skills. And I know that's a major point for most pre-service programs now, I think, but just to really hone in on that so that they can, collect data in their classroom and inform their decision making, I think is just another way we can translate research to practice.
Any other question? Do not be shy. You can also post in the chat if you have a question or a comment. We'll welcome comments too.
Can I say something?
Yes, please.
Hi, everybody. I don't have I know most of the people on this call. It's not a question, but it is a comment. So Bree Scott, who's also on the call, and I co-authored a practice brief on the teacher violence subject. It had to do with teacher well-being. And I just wanted to say how important these practice briefs really are. We're actually working on a project with Columbus City Schools in Ohio right now on a separate project about professional development among school principals. And we've actually used that practice brief as literature. We've been, providing them to these school principals who have been just eating it up. They're eating it up. They just love this because it's so approachable. It's an appropriate length and it's very action oriented. So this stuff really does work. So I just wanted to just speak to that, having helped write one and now disseminating one to practitioners who are in schools. These are school principals, specifically it was elementary school principals that we first talked to. We're talking to more. So I just wanted to, as an advocate for it and as boots on the ground, I want to tell you that this stuff really is important. And we're going to be doing. I'm doing another one with Eric Anderman on first gen students. So Alysia knows that. And so yeah, we're. I just wanted. This is awesome stuff.
My pre-service teachers love them too, because they're, easily digestible and they get them thinking and they give us something to discuss in class without them having to read some really long, complicated article.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is something maybe we could talk about more in the practice committee. Is there a way to capture who's downloading the briefs and reading them? I know I get things like ResearchGate just tells me everyone who reads one of my articles. Something to think about.
Yeah, I will say one thing more. I will say is practitioners. They're not afraid of research once you explain to them. Once you make it digestible, they embrace it. Most of them do. It's not that there's some anti research or anti evidence. Most practitioners are open to, are welcome to the evidence. It's just getting on a level that they can understand. I think that's the bigger hurdle. Many times research articles or journal articles, they have this barrier of like the language, the terminology, and that's what they see as a barrier, and lowering that barrier so they can actually access the information. That's the key. But most of them are receptive, in my personal experience.
I think that time is a barrier as well, right? Because we know that teachers and administrators have 10 million things to do. And so sitting down and reading a 30-page article that they have to spend a lot of time deciphering and looking up words, and that's a major time barrier, even if they do have the skills to understand it. And so providing it in a digestible, small format that can then direct them to some more reading if they decide that it's a good fit for them, right? And so I think that's a real benefit as well, of the format.
Yeah, and this connects to the paywall barrier too, right? So it, once they're out of school, out of a university, they might not have access to the journal articles, right? And they'd have to pay $30, $100 to access them. So making this stuff free, I think is really, really important for us to keep doing.
So I have one last question, and we can kind of close out. But I'm curious if you had to say, like, a general give or take, what is like the timeline of submitting a practice brief to the practice committee? I know there's probably revisions and stuff, but if you had to give like a guesstimate, what do you think?
Well, we have some real people on the call. I mean, I would say probably at least a year. It can take a year. It depends on how quickly you can turn back revisions. So we have some authors we're working with where, they got a lot of stuff going on. They don't get back to us quite as frequently. We only meet once a month. And so we'll try to look at whatever's come in each time we meet. But we do go back and forth quite a few times. So it's not a quick process.
I don't know if ours took a whole year. I mean, we went through 3 or 4 different rounds, but it was very efficient, and we were getting very rapid feedback from multiple people. It was very efficient and very useful. So
Yeah,
we didn't find
the
that
faster you go,
laborious
the
at
faster we go.
all. And we went fast. Bree will tell you. We went fast.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Thank
I
you
think
so
that's
much.
really a major factor is just how quickly authors are able to then respond to feedback. That really influences how quickly the process is able to go.
Thank you. So throw some love in the chat or, get your emojis up. Thank you, our panelists. So thank you to everyone for sharing your insights and advice for translating research to practice. Thank you to our audience for engaging and learning with us today. I guess, Joey, could you pull up? Do we have the next advertisement ready? Yes. Perfect. Okay, so we have another webinar coming up. So this will be on April 21st, and we are partnering with the Division 15 Policy Committee about advancing research through policy, how to advocate for educational change. And so here's the information. You can register for it. I will leave the link. Okay, it's already ready to go, dropped in the chat. But thank you all for joining us today. Hope to see you at the next webinar.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you guys so much.
See many of you at AERA.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.